I knew the moment that pontoon boat slid away from my dock. Karen, sitting stiff-backed, her HOA lawyer, whispering in her ear that this wasn't just another petty HOA dispute. This was a full-blown power grab for a $3 million private island, and the people coming after me had no idea they were picking a fight with the county sheriff himself. They tried everything: fake environmental claims, doctored drone photos, even hiring private security dressed up like law enforcement to inspect my cabin, all because Karen decided my island, my sanctuary, would look better as part of her luxury lakeside resort project. But here's the thing about being sheriff: you get used to recognizing predators long before they pounce. And when HOA Karen set her sights on my land, she didn't realize I had something she didn't: facts, law, and a whole lot of patience for watching a liar expose herself. Before we jump in, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there, and don't forget to subscribe for more insane HOA stories just like this one. 3 years before all this madness, my life had been a whole lot quieter. I wasn't rich, I wasn't looking for a fight, and I definitely wasn't imagining I'd end up defending a private island from the most unhinged HOA president I'd ever met. Back then, I was just Theo Marshall, a middle-aged sheriff who loved a good cup of black coffee, a quiet morning patrol, and weekends spent anywhere but around people complaining about lawn heights and mailbox colors. Then Aunt Eleanor died. God rest her soul. She was eccentric, brilliant, and stubborn as a brick wall. I expected maybe a little money, maybe a piece of furniture from her old lake house. What I didn't expect was an entire lakefront property and a tiny man-made island smack in the middle of the water. The letter from her attorney didn't feel real at first. I remember rereading the line, "To my nephew Theo, I leave my island, keep it safe," about 5 times before sitting back and laughing. I thought she was being poetic. I thought island meant a patch of land, a sandbar, or a cute nickname she gave some protruding rocks. But no. It was a genuine island, about the size of a small baseball field back then, barely rising above the water. Over the years, she had hauled in gravel, reinforced the shoreline, planted little shrubs, and even registered it as an independent parcel with its own lot number. The woman really built a tiny sovereign kingdom out there, one the county recognized, one the state taxed, and one every HOA within 10 miles had absolutely zero authority over. I didn't appreciate the genius of that until later. At the time, I was just fascinated. I spent the better part of a year sorting through all the paperwork Eleanor left behind: permits, environmental assessments, water rights, zoning letters. She didn't just build a quirky retreat, she built a legal fortress. It would take an army of bureaucrats to touch that island. So I followed her blueprint. I brought in contractors to stabilize the shoreline. I expanded it by a few feet with carefully placed fill, all approved. I built a modern micro-cabin, solar power, rainwater filtration, composting toilet, everything off-grid and eco-friendly. I put in a reinforced dock so my kids could safely jump off it in the summer. If Eleanor had built the foundation, I built the legacy. My wife loved the place. My kids loved it even more. Long weekends, school breaks, we'd pack up fishing rods, hot dogs, and board games, and the whole world felt miles away. No radios, no HOA complaints, no calls about teenagers drag racing on county roads. Just quiet. Even as sheriff, I needed that escape. Maybe especially as sheriff. There's something about spending every day dealing with people's worst impulses that makes you appreciate a little patch of earth where none of that can reach you. The lake itself wasn't huge, 40, maybe 50 acres, surrounded by old farmland on one side and modern suburbia creeping in on the other. For a while, nobody bothered me. The lake was too small to attract boaters, too shallow for big fishermen crowds, and too inconvenient for tourists. Perfect, in other words. Then Pine Water Reserve started construction on the Eastern Valley. Now, if you've never heard of Pine Water Reserve, imagine the kind of neighborhood where the brochures use phrases like elevated lifestyle curation, and the houses come with mandatory memberships to committees you didn't ask for. The kind of place where a guy in loafers and a golf visor will lecture you about the angle of your garden hose. I figured they'd stay on their side of the lake. Pine Water was fancy, expensive, pristine, as in prepackaged plastic pristine. I'm talking lawns cut with laser precision kids on electric scooters and Amazon drones buzzing overhead like grumpy metal mosquitoes. At first it seemed harmless. Residents would kayak out on weekends. Kids would paddle closer and shout, "Cool house," before their parents pulled them away like I was harboring contraband. I'd wave. I wasn't a hermit, I didn't mind the curiosity. Then I found one of their glossy brochures washed up on my shore. The aerial photo of the lake was edited so heavily that the island, my island, was blurred out like it was some kind of government secret. The rest of the lake was crisp blue and postcard perfect. The center a smudged gray blotch. That was the first flicker of unease. Not anger, just suspicion. But suspicion didn't stop me from enjoying the place. On a warm weekend afternoon, I was knee-deep in the water clearing debris from the intake pump. My youngest son was on the dock feeding a stubborn turtle bits of apple, while my dog slept beside him like a sun-warmed loaf of bread. The breeze was soft, the water shimmering. Peace. Then I heard a soft hum. Low, steady mechanical. Not the usual outboard motor noise. I turned and saw a sleek pontoon boat drifting toward the island, white hull, chrome accents, the kind of boat people buy when they want to look like they make passive income off rental properties. 3 people were aboard, all wearing white linen, all with sunglasses that cost more than my mortgage, all standing like they were arriving for a yacht club inspection. That was the first time I saw Karen Wilson. Perfectly ironed blazer, blonde bob haircut sharp enough to slice an apple, smile bright but eyes absolutely dead. She looked like the final boss of every HOA horror story ever told. Beside her stood Jill, her PR liaison, with a clipboard the size of a legal binder, and behind them was Brad, their legal consultant, who gave off the vibe of a man who practiced his smirks in the mirror. They didn't ask permission, they didn't wave, they didn't slow down. They pulled right up to my dock like they owned waterfront privileges. I stood up, water dripping off my shirt, and watched Karen step off the boat. She extended her hand like this was a meet and greet. "Lovely spot you've got here," she said, eyes roaming like she was evaluating resale value. "Really a shame it isn't available to the community." I raised an eyebrow. "It's not part of your community." Brad chuckled under his breath, forced, rehearsed, and annoying as hell. Karen didn't blink. "This lake," she said, with a practiced politician's tone, "has been voted into the Pinewater Reserve jurisdiction." And that's when the alarms went off in my head. Not literally, those came later. But inside me, something shifted. As sheriff, I'd been lied to by drug dealers, con artists, and people who thought they were a whole lot smarter than they actually were. I knew the look of someone trying to wrap a lie in pretty language. Karen was gift-wrapping something very ugly. And little did she know, I wasn't just the owner of the island. I was the one man in the entire county with the training, authority, and stubbornness to take down people who thought they were above the law. Karen's smile froze in place, but her eyes sharpened. It was the look someone gives right before they tell you a rule they just made up on the spot. I'd seen that look 1,000 times, mostly from people who thought flashing confidence could hide the fact they were dead wrong. Behind her, Jill flipped open her clipboard. It wasn't a normal clipboard either. It was one of those oversized, leather-bound presentation portfolios, the kind HOA officers use when they're about to justify something completely insane with colorful charts. Brad adjusted his sunglasses, puffed out his chest, and gave me a nod like he'd just delivered a punchline. He hadn't said a word yet, but the man already radiated lawyer who bills $900 per hour for bad advice. I stepped fully out of the water, grabbed a towel, and dried my hands slow enough to make it clear I'm not the least bit intimidated by your little field trip. Karen clasped her hands together in front of her politician style and spoke again. "Since Pinewater Reserve now manages the lake," she said with that brittle smile, "we're updating our records. This island has come up as a question." "A question," I echoed. "It's a parcel of land. With a deed. Recorded before your HOA even existed." Karen didn't even flinch. "Yes, well," she replied smoothly, "the community voted last month to extend our jurisdiction to all shared water resources." I blinked, slowly. "You mean your HOA voted?" I said. "Among yourselves." She nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. A unanimous decision. That doesn't mean anything to the county, or to the state, or to me." Her smile stiffened. "When a community acts together, we believe it should mean something." I tossed the towel over my shoulder. "You believe wrong." Brad chose that moment to speak for the first time, leaning forward with a swagger that screamed trust fund kid who thinks quoting statutes makes him dangerous. "Actually," he said, drawing out the word like a lecture when an HOA expands jurisdiction, "it doesn't." I cut him off. "Not over land it doesn't own. Not over water it doesn't manage. And definitely not over an island that predates the HOA by 30 years. Brad opened his mouth, closed it, then adjusted his sunglasses again. I almost felt bad for the guy. He had walked into a battle with someone who actually knew the law instead of pretending to. Karen snapped her fingers lightly toward Jill. "Jill, the report." Jill nodded and pulled out a glossy folder. She opened it and turned it so I could see. Inside were photos, drone photos taken from high angles and printed with little red circles. They had circled my solar panels, my dock, my erosion reinforcements, even a composting toilet pipe. This Jill began in the tone of a kindergarten teacher explaining shapes is considered unregulated development on a shared resource. I stared at the folder, then at her. You know, I said if you're going to doctor drone images, maybe crop out the Pinewater landscaping trucks reflected in the water. Karen stiffened. Jill blinked. Brad coughed. I continued, and that solar array? Fully permitted. County approved. Twice. Inspected. You want the names of the inspectors? I know them. Karen pursed her lips. We're not here to argue, she said, voice tight. We're here to offer solutions. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a big laugh, but enough to break her rhythm. Solutions, I repeated. To what problem? Karen took a small breath, steadying her tone. The problem, she said patiently, is that your island is not accessible to the community. It sits in the center of a shared lake. Pinewater Reserve residents have expressed concerns. No, they haven't, I interrupted. You have. You alone. Her eye twitched. Barely, but enough. She was losing the polished composure she'd walked in with. So I said, what's the real reason you're here? She folded her arms. We want to bring the lake into full harmony with our community vision, she replied. That includes ensuring all structures meet environmental and aesthetic standards. Your aesthetic standards, I corrected, not mine. And not the laws. Karen leveled her gaze at me. It would be easier for everyone if you cooperated. The wind picked up slightly, rocking the pontoon boat against my dock. My son's fishing pole clattered gently against the wood, and the turtle he had been feeding poked its head above the water just long enough to gauge the tension before disappearing again. I wiped my face with the towel. I'm not joining your HOA, I said. No one asked you to, Karen replied sweetly. HOA membership is irrelevant here. Good, I said, stepping forward, because this island doesn't answer to you. Her expression hardened. Not yet. It was subtle, but it was there. A promise or a threat, depending on how you wanted to read it. I chose threat. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, Mr. Marshall, she said with finality. We'll be in touch. She turned and climbed back onto the pontoon boat. Brad followed, shooting me a look meant to be intimidating. It wasn't. Jill simply avoided eye contact, clutching her clipboard like a shield. The boat drifted backward, turned, and glided across the lake. Karen's silhouette stood rigid at the helm, her linen blazer fluttering lightly in the breeze. I watched them go, towel still hanging over my shoulder. Then something in my stomach twisted. A feeling I hadn't gotten in years, not since I'd worked a case involving a real estate developer who thought arson was a negotiating tactic. A warning bell, low, subtle, unmistakable. My dog wandered over and nudged my hand, sensing tension. I scratched his head absently. My son wandered back to the cabin, oblivious to what had just happened, humming and skipping along the dock. I stayed there a long time, staring at the shrinking shape of the pontoon boat. Karen had said 6 words that rattled me more than anything. We voted to extend our jurisdiction. HOAs can vote on flower beds, fencing, guidelines, mailbox height, parking rules, but they cannot rewrite land titles. They cannot lay claim to land they don't own. They cannot invent authority. Unless they try to make the county believe it's legal. Unless they bury you in paperwork until you can't breathe. Unless they find a loophole nobody else bothered to close. Unless someone with money stands to profit. The glint in Karen's eye told me everything. This wasn't about environmental protection. This wasn't about community access. This had nothing to do with shared resources or lake harmony or whatever buzzword they had printed on their brochure. This was a land grab, a hostile takeover wrapped in a linen blazer and HOA jargon. And as the sheriff of the county, the man responsible for upholding the law, not twisting it, I suddenly found myself in the crosshairs of a woman who thought rules applied only when she needed them to. I walked back toward the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a long, shimmering path across the water. The place felt different now. Not ruined, just claimed, marked. They'd stepped onto my land today. Next time they wouldn't come as politely, and I'd be ready. Because if Karen wanted a war of paperwork, politics, and pressure, she was about to discover she'd picked the wrong sheriff to mess with. The next morning I was back in uniform, not because I was working, but because I planned to spend the day in town handling paperwork, and wearing the badge meant I didn't have to answer a lot of unnecessary questions. My deputies could handle the beat. What I needed was information clean, official, and recorded before Karen could twist anything. The county records office sat in an old brick building that smelled like a combination of dusty binders and burnt coffee. I'd been here 1,000 times, sometimes to file warrants, sometimes to settle disputes between neighbors who hated each other more than I hated HOA bylaws. But that morning, I walked in like a man preparing for battle. Drew, the clerk on duty, looked up as I stepped inside. Bald head, thick glasses, Marine Corps tattoo running down his right forearm. He was one of those guys who loved paperwork the way some people loved puppies. Every time I visited, he'd tell me about some new loophole he discovered while reading zoning code for fun. "Forced vacation today?" Sheriff Drew asked, grinning. "Not exactly." I leaned on the counter. "I need everything you've got on Pine Water Reserve's expansion filings, land use petitions, environmental submissions, anything related to the lake." Drew's smile faded. "Uh-oh, sounds like trouble." "You could say that." He typed with the speed of a man who had spent decades mastering the keyboard and absolutely nothing else in life. Seconds later, the printer began spitting out documents like an agitated slot machine. I started reading. What I found made my jaw clench. Pine Water Reserve had filed a petition quietly, strategically, to reclassify the entire lake as a community-managed recreational ecosystem. That was a fancy way of saying, "We want authority and will disguise it as environmental concern." The wording was dangerous. Not illegal, but carefully crafted to tug at the heartstrings of county officials who didn't understand the subtle landmine buried inside the request. Worse, the proposal listed unregulated shoreline disruption as a threat to the lake's long-term health. And the accompanying aerial photos, they circled my island, my dock, my solar panels, my rainwater filtration unit, everything. I flipped through the pages, heat rising inside my chest. A part of me, the sheriff part, wanted to stay objective, to analyze the facts logically. But the man part of me, the man who'd poured sweat, money, and love into that island, he was starting to boil. Still, I kept reading. The petition had already moved forward. It was now in the hands of the County Environmental Review Council. That council had the power to trigger inspections, restrictions, and temporary access limits for ecological safety. In other words, Karen was trying to weaponize environmental protection laws to trap me in bureaucratic quicksand. I rubbed my forehead. "You've got to be kidding me," Drew chuckled bitterly. "Sheriff, I've seen some sneaky filings in my day, but this one's got perfume on it." I glanced at him. "Perfume?" He smirked. "Yeah. The kind of paperwork that shows up smelling like somebody's rich wife wrote it in her home office after a glass of Chardonnay." I huffed out a laugh despite myself. "That accurate, huh, Sheriff? I've met the woman," he said, lowering his voice. "She came in here 2 weeks ago asking how to expedite jurisdictional transitions. I told her that's not a real phrase. She winked at me and handed me a brochure." "Sounds right," I muttered. Drew tapped the stack of papers. "You want more, everything you've got." He returned a minute later with a flash drive. All digital files, emails, annex, maps, zoning overlays. I pulled from every public access system plus a few that ain't meant for civilians. I shot him a look. He raised his hands. "Relax. I didn't break the law. But let's just say some departments don't label their files clearly." I pocketed the drive. "Thanks, Drew. Anytime." And Sheriff, he leaned closer. "If Karen's playing dirty, you should know she didn't file everything under Pine Water Reserve." "What do you mean?" He pulled up a separate folder on his monitor. "These right here," he said, tapping the screen, "were filed under a development company, Coastal Delta Holdings, LLC. I froze. "Development company," I repeated. Developing what Drew opened the file. There it was. A glossy concept rendering titled Pine Water Wellness and Luxury Expansion Phase 2. At the center of the plans was a luxury villa. On my island, a curved dock, a private boat lift, solar cabanas, floating platforms, a logo reading Delta Wellness Experience. And below it, pending jurisdictional resolution and removal of unregulated structures. My eyes narrowed. Karen hadn't just wanted jurisdiction, she wanted ownership. My island wasn't a nuisance to her. It was a gold mine. And she wanted it gone. I left the records office carrying a binder so thick it could have doubled as a riot shield. I sat in my truck for a good minute staring at the dashboard. I wasn't angry, not yet. It was something colder, something steadier. A sheriff's kind of anger, the emotion that comes right before a criminal case starts. I drove straight to Cassidy's office. She worked out of a refurbished brick building that used to be a post office, and now smelled faintly of cinnamon candles and legal doom. When I walked in, she was sprawled across her chair with a pen between her teeth, reading 3 files at once. She looked up. "Well, Theo, your face says either you found gold or you found a bomb." "Both," I said, dropping the binder onto her desk. The thud shook her coffee mug. She opened it. Her eyes widened. She flipped a page, and another, and another. "Well, hell," she muttered. "They're laying the groundwork to steal your island," with a smile. Can they? I asked. Not legally, she said. But they can stall you, bury you in inspections, hit you with access restrictions, maybe even temporary demolition orders if they fake environmental threats. They'll suffocate the island slowly. And the villa plans, she tapped the page. This is the smoking gun. They're not trying to protect the lake, they're trying to turn your island into a cash cow. I folded my arms. So what do? Cassidy leaned back, flipping the pen in her hand like a switchblade. We go to war. The way she said it, casual, sharp, almost amused, made something settle inside me. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land. I was fighting for Eleanor's legacy, for my kids' summers, for the one place in the world where my badge didn't weigh me down, and I'd be damned if I let an HOA president in designer sunglasses take it from me. I left Cassidy's office with a plan forming in my mind. A lawful, structured, airtight plan because I knew exactly how people like Karen operated. They wanted you angry. They wanted you reckless. They wanted you emotional enough to make mistakes. But I wasn't just a landowner. I was the sheriff. The law was my battlefield. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed back toward the lake. The sun hung low, turning the water into a sheet of molten gold. From a distance, Pine Water Reserve looked like a postcard. Clean homes, manicured lawns, perfect symmetry. But beneath that neat little surface, something rotten was brewing. As I approached the dock, I caught sight of something new on the shoreline opposite the island. Construction equipment, survey flags, workers unloading lumber. I stopped in my tracks. They were building a public pier right across from my island. The first move in a long game. And just like that, the warning bell inside me went from a faint hum to a ringing siren. I stood on my dock for a long minute staring at the opposite shore. I could see the bright orange vests of the workers, the clatter of lumber being unloaded, and the unmistakable outline of survey tripods lining the shoreline like a military formation. Even from this distance, I could hear the rhythmic pounding of stakes being driven into the soil. A public pier. And not just any pier, something oversized, overbuilt, and overfunded. They weren't hiding it. They weren't easing into things. No, this was a declaration. A way of planting their HOA flag as close to my island as humanly possible without renting a boat. I pulled out my binoculars, the same pair I used on patrol when scanning tree lines for missing hikers. Through the lenses, I could see a large sign propped against a truck. Pine Water Community Pier. Phase 1 Restoration Project Restoration. A word that had been twisted so many times by HOAs it might as well mean, we're doing whatever we want. I zoomed in farther. There was Jill in her white linen outfit, clipboard in hand, talking to the foreman. She pointed at the water, then at my island, then at a set of blueprints she unfurled like a general planning troop movement. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just yesterday they'd played nice. Today they were invading the shoreline with heavy machinery. I felt my jaw tighten as I lowered the binoculars. Not because of the pier itself. People build docks all the time. But because I knew exactly what this was. A public access anchor point. A gateway to claim proximity. Then influence. Then regulation. The oldest land grab trick in the book. Before my temper could simmer past the point of logic, I walked to my cabin, grabbed my radio, and switched to a frequency my deputies knew only I used. Dispatch, this is Marshall. Patch me to Deputy Hargrove. A crackle. Then go ahead, Sheriff. Hargrove, I need you to log a preliminary inquiry for construction occurring on the northeast shoreline of Lake Pinewater. No action yet, just a record. Understood, Sheriff. Reason I looked across the lake again, watching the workers hammer posts into ground that was, according to the maps I'd reviewed, still classified as partial conservation zone. Possible zoning violations, I said. Just keep the log open. Copy that. I clicked off the radio. That was enough, just enough to create an official timestamp in the system. If the HOA or their developers stepped out of line, I'd have a trail to follow. Neutral, legal, documented. But I wasn't going to march over there and shut them down. That would be Karen's dream, me abusing my badge so she could scream sheriff overreach from every HOA newsletter and Facebook mom group within a 50-mile radius. No, if Karen wanted a war, I'd give her one. But it would be the kind of war she didn't know how to fight, one fought with statutes, logs, permits, evidence, and patience. Still, just watching that construction churn ate at me. By evening, the pier foundations were already set, and by the time the sun dipped below the hills, lights from temporary generators glowed across the water like some kind of suburban lighthouse warning me they weren't backing off. I locked the cabin, got in my boat, and rode back toward town before it got fully dark. I kept my radio close, half expecting some new nonsense to unfold in my absence. but the lake was quiet, at least on the surface. The next day, I returned, prepared to check on the island, expecting a quiet morning. Instead, I found something that made me stop dead on the dock. A boat, not a pontoon, not a kayak. A sleek white vessel with Pinewater Lake Watch stenciled on the side in big navy letters. It was creeping around the island in a slow circle like a shark scenting blood. 2 people sat aboard matching polo shirts, sunglasses, and clipboards. Of course they had clipboards. I tied off my own boat and watched them, arms folded. If they saw me, they didn't show it. They circled once, twice, then slowed as they approached the dock. I already knew where this was heading. Sure enough, the boat drifted even closer. One of the polo-shirted men cleared his throat theatrically. "Afternoon," he said, as they eased beside my dock. "We're conducting a routine compliance inspection." "No, you're not," I said flatly. "Back up." The man tried again, switching to a softer tone. "Sir, we've received reports of unsafe shoreline structures." "No, you haven't." The second man reached for the rail, preparing to step onto the dock. "We're authorized by Pinewater Reserve to authorize by who I asked. Your HOA, your board, your PR department." The first man lifted a shiny metal badge clipped to his belt, too shiny, too perfect, too mass-produced to belong to any real agency. "This grants us access," he said. I laughed. Not even politely, just laughed. Then I reached down, untied the dock cleat, and shoved their bow off the dock with one hard push. The boat drifted back, the man scrambling for balance. "Sir," the first guy barked. "You don't have jurisdiction," I said. "You don't have legal standing. And that badge, you can buy a pack of those online for $14.99. The second man glared. "We can report you for obstructing. Obstructing what your cosplay. If they'd had actual authority, they wouldn't have backed down. But they did. They drifted backward, embarrassed and furious, writing something on their fake forms like children pretending to take notes. When they finally motored off, I lowered myself onto the dock steps and ran a hand through my hair. They were escalating testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, gathering whatever scraps they could twist into ammunition. I stayed on the island the rest of the day, doing small repairs, checking my security cameras, clearing brush from the path. But a heaviness followed me around like a storm shadow. Late afternoon, as I was setting up a new motion sensor, I looked up and froze. A woman stood on the nearly finished pier across the lake, holding her phone up, recording. She wasn't filming the lake, she wasn't filming the construction, she was filming me. I raised a hand in a polite wave, the kind you give a nosy passerby, to let them know you see them. She flipped me off, not once, but twice, then kept recording. For the first time since this whole mess began, I felt something under my skin that wasn't anger. It was the cold sense that the HOA wasn't just trying to take the island. They were trying to villainize me, frame me, turn me into the enemy of the lake. I finished my work in silence and made a decision. If they were watching me, then I needed to know exactly what they were planning. The next morning, I headed back into town, straight to the records office, to Drew, to the files that HOA members didn't want anyone to see. Because if they were building a pier, sending fake patrol boats, and recording me from across the lake, something bigger was coming. Something far uglier. Something they thought I wouldn't see until it was too late. They were wrong. I'd spent my entire career recognizing when predators were circling, and the HOA had just made the mistake of circling a sheriff. Before sunrise the next morning, I was already driving toward the county seat, coffee steaming in the cup holder, and a coil of tension tight in my chest. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman on the pier pointing her phone at me like she was collecting evidence for a crime I hadn't committed. I knew the look, someone preparing a narrative, not documenting a moment. And I'd spent too many years as sheriff to mistake that for harmless curiosity. When I reached the county building, the parking lot was empty, the sky still dark. Drew wasn't due for another 20 minutes. But when I knocked on the locked glass doors, I saw him through the lobby window, already inside, sipping sludge-like coffee from his metal thermos. He shuffled over and unlocked the door. "You're early," he said, blinking at me through fogged glasses. "You ever seen Pinewater do something that wasn't sneaky?" I asked. He snorted. "Fair point. Come on in." I followed him through the narrow hallway lined with filing cabinets, each one packed with records older than both of us combined. "Tell me," I said as he powered up his computer, "what else do you have on that development company?" "Coastal Delta Holdings." Drew cracked his knuckles. "Let's see." He started typing. The screen flashed through various department databases. Land use, environmental, business registry, infrastructure proposals. Finally, he opened a folder labeled Phase Dev Applications. Private. He clicked. Dozens of files popped up. A second later, the printer started rumbling again. Coastal Delta has been very busy, Drew muttered. Filed under different departments, different divisions, sometimes with different shell company names. But it all funnels back to the same place. He printed the first packet and handed it to me. What am I looking at? I asked. A multi-phase rejuvenation initiative, he said, lifting his fingers in air quotes as if the phrase were allergic to honesty. I skimmed the pages. Floating yoga decks, modular rental cabins, a Zen kayak beach, and right in the center my island replaced with a 2-story glass and wood villa featuring private docks, wraparound decks, and a spa. I felt my stomach knot. This is a done deal, I said quietly. They've already sold the idea. They're trying to Drew corrected. Nothing approved yet, but they're courting investors. Hard. I read deeper. The next page made my jaw clench. A series of emails, some from Coastal Delta staff, some from Pine Water Reserve HOA, and one from a familiar name, Karen Wilson. Her email said, pending successful jurisdictional resolution of the island encroachment issue, Phase 2 construction can begin Q2 next year. Attached is the updated render for investor review. Below it, a message from a Coastal Delta executive. We look forward to securing this parcel. Please confirm removal timeline of the current occupant. Current occupant, not owner, not deed holder. Occupant, as if I was squatting. Drew whistled low as I turned the pages. You going to take this to your lawyer? He asked. I'm taking everything to her, I said, stacking the documents. And then I'm taking someone to court. Sheriff Drew said carefully, You know, if they're this bold on paper, they're twice as bold off record. I know, I replied, and I think they're just getting started. I left the office with the binder pressed under my arm, feeling the weight of it like a tactical vest. Not heavy, but loaded. On the drive back, the sky turned gold. Normally, I loved that view. But that morning, it felt like something cinematic right before the villain springs the next trap. By the time I reached the lake, the wind had picked up. My boat rocked as I crossed the water toward the island spray hitting my face. The moment I stepped onto the dock, I froze. Something felt wrong. It wasn't obvious. Nothing looked broken, nothing out of place. But the silence was off. Too still, like the air was holding its breath. I walked up the path toward the cabin, scanning the ground the way I'd been trained. Slow, deliberate, checking for footprints, disturbances, snapped twigs. Then I saw it. The cabin door wasn't completely shut, just slightly ajar. My pulse spiked. I approached cautiously, stepping to the side of the doorway the way years of law enforcement instinct had taught me. I nudged the door open with the back of my knuckles. Inside the cabin looked ransacked. Drawers opened, cabinets half pulled, papers scattered. Even the rug was kicked aside like someone had checked under it, and in the middle of the chaos were 2 men, both in dark blue uniforms, both wearing belts with pepper spray handcuffs, radios, and neither wearing a single legitimate law enforcement patch. The older one, broad shoulders and gray stubble, didn't even turn around when he spoke. Sir, we're conducting an inspection under HOA directive. Please vacate the structure. My voice dropped. Show me your warrant. The younger man glanced at me with a smirk, then back to rifling through my drawers. We received a complaint, he said. Suspicious activity on HOA-regulated property. This property isn't HOA regulated. That's under review, the older one said, annoyed. I stepped fully into the doorway. You've got 10 seconds, I said quietly, to tell me what agency you work for. Neither responded. The older one turned one hand resting on the pepper spray. Sir, if you threaten, footsteps sounded on the dock outside. Heavy, confident footsteps. Then a familiar voice bellowed. Theo relief washed over me. Noah, former Army Ranger, current wilderness instructor. Guy once chased off a black bear with a frying pan. He stepped into the cabin, took one look at the uniforms and froze. Then he muttered, Nope, those aren't cops. Before I could say anything, the older fake officer reached for his canister. Noah moved faster, lightning fast. He grabbed the man's badge, snapped the chain, yanked it off, and punched him square in the face. The guy dropped like he'd been unplugged from life itself. The younger man bolted, sprinting out the cabin, down the dock, and straight into the lake as he jumped desperately onto the boat and floored the motor. I exhaled and pulled out my radio. Dispatch this, is Sheriff Marshall. I have a code 6-3 on Lake Pine Water. Unauthorized individuals impersonating law enforcement. Send a unit. The real deputies came 15 minutes later. They cuffed the unconscious one, who woke up screaming about rights he didn't have, and hauled him away. Records later confirmed both men worked for Northern Apex Risk Solutions, a private security firm, one partially owned by Aaron Wilson. Karen's husband. The pieces started connecting in a sickening chain. Fake inspections, fake patrols, fake authority, real criminal intent. That night, after filing the reports and making sure the arrested man was booked, I returned to the island to breathe, or try to. But as I sat on the dock, watching moonlight ripple across the water, Noah handed me a flask. "You're not going to let them win, right?" he asked. I took a long breath. Not a chance. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't possibly guess, was that Karen wasn't close to finished. She had barely gotten started. Because less than 48 hours later, I woke up to the first real sign that this wasn't just harassment, it was sabotage, it was surveillance, it was arson, and it was personal. Very, very personal. 2 days after the fake cop incident, I woke before dawn to a strange stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful, more like the air is waiting for something to go wrong. I sat up in the cabin listening. No loons calling, no wind against the windows. Even the usual gentle lapping of water against the dock felt subdued, like the lake itself was holding its breath. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, tugged on my boots, and stepped outside. The sky was barely light, a pale gray smear pushing against the edges of the horizon. I stretched, cracked my neck, and walked toward the utility shed to check the solar inverter. After the mess with the fake officers, I decided to double-check everything on the island each morning. But when I flipped the power switch, the lights flickered once, then died. The inverter hummed, then coughed out a sputter. That sickening choking sound told me everything I needed to know this wasn't a technical failure. I climbed the ladder to the roof, pried open the panel casing, and felt my stomach drop. The main conduit, thick, insulated durable, had been cut clean through. Not frayed, not chewed by wildlife, not damaged by weather. Cut, deliberately. Like someone had taken bolt cutters and sliced straight through the lifeline of my entire power system. For a moment, all I could do was stare at it. The silence of the island suddenly felt hostile. I climbed down, went straight for the water collection system, and checked the main filtration line. At first glance, it looked untouched. But then I noticed a small anomaly, a pile of smooth river stones stacked too neatly beneath the pipe, like someone had tried to hide something. I crouched. Underneath the stones was a small black device the size of a lighter, blinking a faint green pulse. A GPS tracker. Wired, shielded, industrial grade. My chest tightened. I picked it up carefully, turned it over, examined the edges. A tiny engraved serial number gleamed beneath the morning light. This wasn't some cheap Amazon gadget. This was professional surveillance equipment, and someone had been close enough on my land to plant it. I stood up slowly, scanning the tree line. The island was small, and I'd always thought that made it secure. You can't sneak around a place this size without making noise or leaving footprints. But whoever did this was careful, skilled, comfortable working in the dark. And the GPS device confirmed one thing: they weren't gathering evidence. They were tracking my movements, where I went, when I left, when the island was empty, when it was vulnerable. I set the tracker on my work table like it was a venomous snake and took a long breath before pulling out my phone. There was only one person I trusted to identify the device fast: Nate, freelance cybersecurity specialist. Socially awkward, always drinking energy drinks, always wearing mismatched socks. Brilliant in ways I still didn't fully understand. I'd helped him fix his boat dock last winter and saved him from drowning once when he fell in wearing 2 jackets for some reason. He owed me. He picked up on the second ring. "Sheriff," he croaked, sounding like he'd swallowed sandpaper. "What's wrong? I'm bringing something to your shop," I said. "Don't touch it when I put it down." He paused. "Is it explosive?" "No. But it's not friendly. Copy. Bring donuts." I hung up, slipped the tracker into a padded container, and took my boat across the lake. I kept my eyes on the Pinewater shoreline the entire time, half expecting to see someone recording me again. But the pier was empty, quiet and freshly cleaned, like they'd scrubbed away yesterday's trespassers. When I reached Nate's shop, a converted barn filled with more wires and screens than I'd ever seen in one place. I placed the tracker gently on his metal workbench. He leaned over it with a magnifying visor strapped to his forehead like a mad scientist. "Oh," he said, "this is expensive. How expensive? Expensive, expensive." He tapped the engraved serial number. "You can't buy these. You lease them through security firms. Contract only." "Which firm?" I asked. He turned toward his laptop. "Give me 10 minutes. It took him 4. When the results appeared on his screen, he let out a low whistle. "Sheriff, you're not going to like this. I already don't." He rotated the laptop toward me. This unit, he said, is registered to Northern Apex Risk Solutions. My throat tightened. That's the same company those fake officers worked for. And he added carefully, according to the internal data routing, the tracker was linked to a parent company for remote monitoring. I stared at the screen, every muscle in my body tensing. What parent company, I asked. Wilson Holdings Group. The room went silent. Karen's husband. Same last name, same type of money, same connections, same smug entitlement. Every single violation, every intrusion, every fake inspection, every drone photo, all of it flowed back to the same source, the HOA president's family. It wasn't just harassment. It wasn't even just a land grab. This was coordinated, funded, strategic, and personal. I thanked Nate, took a photo of the serial number, and drove back toward the lake with the kind of focus I hadn't felt since my early days in law enforcement. Back when things were simpler and bad guys wore their wrongdoing on their faces instead of behind linen jackets and HOA meeting minutes. The sun was setting by the time I reached the island again. Gold light spread across the water like melted metal. I wanted to admire it. God knows I used to admire it, but now it just looked like a spotlight shining on a battlefield. I set up extra motion detectors along the perimeter path, installed 2 new trail cameras high in the trees, reinforced the solar connections with steel brackets, and bolted the inverter casing shut with tamper-resistant screws. It felt like prepping for a siege. On my own land, by the time I finished, exhaustion pulled at my limbs. But I wasn't going to sleep inside the cabin, not that night. I dragged a camp chair onto the deck crowbar resting beside me and kept watch. At 3:14 a.m., the first alarm went off. A motion trigger near the dock. I shot to my feet, adrenaline flooding my veins. The deck glowed orange through the window, too bright, too sudden. Fire. I grabbed the extinguisher and sprinted toward the dock. The wooden walkway connecting the main path to the harbor was engulfed in flames, fast, hungry flames chewing through the dry planks. Son of a... I blasted the extinguisher, white foam smothering the fire in bursts. The heat scorched my face as I kicked charred wood aside to prevent it spreading. Smoke rose in thick gray waves, stinging my eyes. It took nearly 10 minutes to get the flames under control. My lungs burned. My hands shook. My heart hammered so violently I felt it in my teeth. When the fire was finally out, the dock looked like a ribcage of blackened timbers. I checked my cameras. The feed was dead, smashed, wires cut. Someone had come onto this island in the dead of night. Someone who knew exactly where the cameras were. Someone who knew how to avoid detection except for the last-minute motion trigger. I looked down and saw a small, half-melted scrap lying among the ashes. A laminated corner of something, burnt around the edges, barely intact. I picked it up with shaking fingers. There in the corner, scorched but unmistakable, was the Pine Water Reserve HOA logo. They didn't even try to hide it. They wanted me scared. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me desperate. Instead, I felt something else. Resolved, cold, focused, determined. If Karen thought burning my dock would intimidate me, she had miscalculated. She wasn't facing a homeowner. She was facing the sheriff. And now she'd crossed the line between civil conflict and criminal warfare. I stood on the smoldering remains of my dock, smoke curling into the night sky, and made myself a promise. This ends with truth. This ends with consequences. And it ends with the HOA on its knees. The morning after the fire, I wasn't just tired, I was hollowed out. Not broken, not shaken, not scared. Just stripped down to the bone. When you've served long enough in law enforcement, you learn there are 2 kinds of enemies, the ones who lash out impulsively and the ones who plan. The impulsive ones throw punches. The planners burn your dock at 3 in the morning and leave calling cards. Karen was the latter. I spent the early hours repairing what I could, documenting the burn pattern, photographing every inch of damaged wood, and salvaging whatever remained of the trail cam that had been ripped from its mounting post. Even as I worked, I knew the fire was only the beginning. People like Karen don't escalate unless they think they're winning. The fact she was already resorting to arson told me she was terrified. It also told me she had something big brewing. By noon, I had everything packed into a heavy-duty evidence case, photos, charred fragments, the broken camera core, and the GPS tracker Nate had analyzed. I left the island and headed back to town, the boat engine roaring louder than usual against my anger. Cassidy's office door swung open before I even knocked. She was on the phone pacing, scribbling notes, and waving me inside like she'd been expecting me. When she finally hung up, she looked at my soot-stained clothes and grimaced. "Tell me someone died," she said, "because that's the only reason you should look like this. No one died, I said, dropping the evidence case onto her desk with a heavy thud. But someone tried to send a message. She opened the case, pulled out the melted laminate scrap, and stared at the HOA logo. Oh, for she cut herself off and rubbed her eyes. They're idiots. Criminal idiots. They're getting bold, I said. And desperate. That's good, she muttered, flipping through the photos of the dock. Desperation makes people sloppy. Sloppy people get caught. Nate arrived 10 minutes later, jittery from 2 cans of energy drink, and immediately plugged in the broken trail cam core to extract whatever data remained. The footage was mostly corrupted, but he found one fragment still intact, a partial image of a hand holding a blunt tool mid-swing, a hand with a tattoo. Nate froze the frame, enhanced it, and stared. You're kidding, Cassidy breathed. It was unmistakable. The same tattoo we'd seen earlier in a corporate retreat photo, one featuring Aaron Wilson, Karen's husband, holding a champagne flute and smiling like a man who'd never faced consequences. Cassidy leaned back, grinning like a wolf. They really thought they could get away with this. No, I said. They really thought I wouldn't fight back. We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing filings, evidence, submissions, emergency motions, requests for injunctions. Cassidy typed like her life depended on it, narrating each section as she went. This one freezes HOA. Discretionary accounts, she muttered. This one forces the county to acknowledge your environmental compliance. This one asks for criminal investigation into Northern Apex. And this one, her grin widened, calls for a judicial review of HOA governance misconduct. By 5 o'clock, she had a stack of legal ammunition thick enough to choke a wild boar. The hearing was set for Friday, but Karen wasn't going to wait that long. She had one more trick up her sleeve. The day before the hearing, I was in Cassidy's office reviewing our strategy when the door burst open and her paralegal Mia sprinted in holding a tablet like it was radioactive. You need to see this, she gasped. Cassidy frowned. What now? Mia tapped the screen. A town council live stream appeared. Karen stood at the podium, smiling, sweetly speaking, with the tone of a woman asking politely for sugar while planning to steal your entire pantry. And if we're able to resolve the private island issue, she said, we can repurpose that land into a public wellness retreat. Think meditation cabins, nature therapy, zero-emission lodging, a real gift to our community. My stomach dropped. Cassidy's pencil snapped in half. That's the villa plan, she hissed. She's pitching the Coastal Delta project as a public good. The hypocrisy hit me so hard I had to laugh. She's denying involvement in private development, Mia added, while literally describing the investor deck word for word. Cassidy stood, slammed the tablet onto her desk, and pointed at me. Tomorrow, she said, we bury them. The courthouse was packed on Friday. Reporters, Pinewater residents, curious locals who just liked drama, even a few county officials who sensed the political wildfire building. Karen entered wearing a tailored pastel blazer pearl earrings and a soft expression that didn't fool a single person who'd ever dealt with an HOA in their lives. Her lawyer, Martin, looked like he moisturized with confidence and overpriced cologne. As we took our seats, Cassidy whispered, "Let them talk first. The longer they lie, the harder they fall." The judge entered. The hearing began. Martin stepped forward, dramatically sighing, as though burdened by the weight of the community's suffering. "Your Honor," he began, "we represent Pinewater Reserve, a community deeply concerned about the environmental impact of unregulated development on Lake Pinewater. The island in question is my client's lawfully owned property." Cassidy interrupted before he could finish and predates Pinewater Reserve by nearly 3 decades. Martin tried to object, but the judge allowed her to continue. And then the hammer dropped. Cassidy presented every permit, every environmental clearance, every zoning document, every notarized record, showing the island was a legitimate, independent parcel. Then she shifted to the bombshell evidence: the investor deck, the emails, the development plans, the surveillance balloon invoice, the Northern Apex GPS tracker serial number, the trail cam image with Aaron's tattoo. Each piece landed like a blow, and the courtroom felt smaller with every revelation. By the time Cassidy played a snippet of the town council live stream, Karen promising to repurpose the island, the room erupted in gasps. Karen's face went pale, then pink, then white again. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "are you acting on behalf of Pinewater Reserve or in conjunction with a private development firm?" Karen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Given the evidence, the judge continued, "I am issuing the following orders. All construction and enforcement by Pinewater Reserve is to cease immediately." HOA discretionary accounts are frozen pending audit. This matter is referred to the county prosecutor for potential criminal investigation. The room exploded. Karen stood motionless, as if her brain had tilted sideways. Cassidy exhaled, slowly satisfied. "Told you," she murmured. "The bigger they are, the more crimes they commit on email." But it wasn't over. Not yet. And the next 3 months would prove it. The audit uncovered financial mismanagement so outrageous, it could have been its own reality show. Community dues funneled to shadow companies, fake consulting fees, payments to Northern Apex disguised as public interface coordination, a surveillance balloon tethered above my island costing $12,478. A balloon to spy on me. The county prosecutor filed charges. Fraud, unlawful surveillance, false representation of authority, conspiracy to commit arson. Karen and Aaron were arrested. In the final trial, Karen didn't wear pearls. She wore handcuffs. The jury convicted them both. 12 years. No parole for at least 5. When the verdict was read aloud, I didn't pump my fist. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply exhaled. Because the island wasn't just safe. Justice finally was too. HOA Pinewater Reserve dissolved not long after by court order and by the mass exodus of homeowners who didn't want to be part of a scandalous circus. The illegally built pier was torn down, signs vanished from the trails. The patrol boats disappeared like ghosts. I rebuilt my dock this time using composite materials fire wouldn't eat through, upgraded the solar, buried backup batteries deep beneath the sand, installed a camera system with redundant cellular uplink, and then I installed a sign. One Eleanor would have loved. Private property sovereign parcel not subject to vote. People shared photos of it online. The local paper ran a headline, "Sheriff saves his island, HOA crumbles under corruption scandal." Residents clapped me on the shoulder in grocery stores. Even high school kids visited the island for a civics project and brought a cake that said, "Thanks for fighting the HOA sheriff." But the real reward, standing at the end of my new dock with my kids fishing beside me and the water calm again, quiet, peaceful, untouched, a reminder that some things in life are worth fighting for, not because they're valuable, but because they're home. When the smoke cleared literally and figuratively and the headlines faded, I finally had room to breathe again. The island felt different now, but in the best possible way. Quieter, safer, like the air itself had relaxed. And for the first time in months, I could walk the shoreline without glancing over my shoulder, expecting a drone, a fake officer, or Karen's pontoon boat drifting in like a bad omen. One evening, just as the sun melted into the horizon, I sat at the edge of my rebuilt dock with my kids. They dangled their feet over the water, tossing little bits of bread to the fish while my dog snored between us, belly up and unapologetically loud. This island, my island, was alive again. Not threatened, not contested, just ours. My daughter glanced up at the cedar sign I'd bolted into place, a sign that had already become something of a local legend. "Dad," she asked, "does it mean no one's allowed to come here ever again?" I laughed softly. "Of course not. People can visit. Even after everything that happened." "Sure," I said, ruffling her hair. "They just have to knock first." She giggled, and for a moment everything felt right in the world again. Later that night I stood at the shoreline alone. The lake was still, the breeze was warm, and the sky above looked like something Eleanor would have painted if she'd ever picked up a brush. I wish she could have seen all this, what her little island had become, how far I'd gone to protect it, and how right she'd been when she'd written, "Take care of my island, don't let anyone mess with it." I finally understood. She didn't leave me a quirky piece of land. She left me a lesson, a responsibility, a reminder that peace isn't something you're given, it's something you defend. And as sheriff, as a father, as a man, I'd done exactly that. In life, we like to believe the threats we face will be obvious, the villains easy to spot, the battles clearly marked. But sometimes the real threats wear linen suits, smile like they're doing you a favor, and hide their intentions behind community initiatives and environmental concerns. Sometimes the danger doesn't come with fists or guns, but with paperwork, influence, intimidation, and people who think rules bend for them, but not for anyone else. Karen taught me a truth I won't forget. You don't lose freedom all at once. You lose it inch by inch, signature by signature, silence by silence. And if you're not paying attention, you wake up one day to find a stranger standing on your land with a clipboard telling you it isn't yours anymore. So here's the real takeaway, the one I hope every person listening remembers. Protect what matters. Your home, your peace, your rights. Because no one else will do it for you. And if you stay silent when someone tries to take what's yours, silence becomes permission. Stand up, speak up, document everything. Don't let intimidation push you out of your own life. And when someone tries to steamroll you with fake authority, know the law, use the law, and don't back down. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA neighbor or community bully who tried to push past boundaries? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another insane HOA tale like this one. There'll always be Karens in the world. But as long as there are people willing to stand up for what's right, they never win in the end.